just want to thank everybody for joining us today for our second call with Jennings from the U.S. Chamber to talk about PPP and other things. I'm Sally Harrison, the president of the Chamber, and I just want to thank you for your time. And Jennings, thank you. I know you're busy, really busy, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here with our members and others to give us this really important update. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I have shared the screen, and it is all yours.
Great. Thanks, Sally. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me once again. It's good to be back. It's been a couple of months, I think, since the last time we did a CARES Act presentation, and a lot has changed. Of course, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've seen kind of guidance and all kinds of new information coming out of the SBA and Treasury, seemingly on a week-by-week basis. But a lot has changed, obviously, and I'm sure that many of the people on this call are obviously familiar with the program, have applied for the PPP loan, and now are kind of interested in how forgiveness is going to work, how to apply for forgiveness, what the new rules are. There have been a couple of pieces of legislation that had been passed since the last time we talked, and in the aftermath of the original CARES Act, which was passed on March 27th. So a lot of new information there. Happy to talk about that today. And then, like I said, thank you for everything that you all do at the Mesa Chamber and the partnership that we have with you all. That's really, it's so helpful for us to be able to get things done in Washington, D.C., whether it's on the CARES Act or things related to the COVID-19 response or other issues. The partnership that we have with you all has been fantastic. So we appreciate that as always. So with that being said, I'm going to try to start to share my screen here. Let's see, I think it should be working. There we go. Put it in presentation mode here. There we go. So I'm going to, like I said, talk mostly about the Paycheck Protection Program, discuss some of the updates. I think the biggest update that came was from the beginning of this month when we saw the House and Senate passed legislation that made pretty significant fixes and changes to the program. Talk about that, and then really kind of the forgiveness portion, which I know is kind of top of mind for a lot of the folks on this call. And then I'll conclude by talking a little bit about kind of the next big coronavirus package, the Phase 4 bill, what that is going to potentially look like. Obviously, this pandemic continues, as you all know, more so in Arizona than in a lot of other places in the country. And so businesses are going to continue to need assistance for a longer period, I think, than what Congress had originally anticipated. So there is going to be additional legislation coming forth, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit about that at the end. So the big bill that passed at the beginning of this month was the PPP Flexibility Act of 2020, passed with almost unanimous support, with the exception of one House member from Kentucky. Other than that, Republicans and Democrats came together to make some really significant fixes. It was signed into law on June 5th by the president. And really all the fixes were aimed at encouraging more businesses that had kind of been on the fence and hadn't yet applied for a PPP loan, but were thinking about it, to get off the fence and apply, and to make it easier, quite frankly, for the businesses and give businesses more flexibility, the folks that had already received their PPP loan as well. And as a lot of you all know, there's still about $140 billion left in the Paycheck Protection Program. And so that's why a lot of these changes were made to try to encourage more folks to utilize the program before the June 30th deadline comes up. And June 30th is the deadline by which businesses need to apply for a Paycheck Protection Program loan through their lender. So some of the key changes: it extends forgiveness term from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. That was a big issue for folks, especially as the pandemic continued and the economic slowdown continued. We heard from a lot of businesses that needed to spread out that money, use it for longer than an 8-week period in order to have it be forgiven. So it gives businesses now the option to extend to 24 weeks. And specifically for borrowers that had received a PPP loan before June 5th, you have the option to use either 8 weeks or 24 weeks. For PPP recipients that received their loan after June 5th, after this law was enacted, you will be using the 24-week period and not the 8-week period. So wanted to make that distinction. It revises the 75-25 requirement down to 60-40, and that's the requirement for how you use the loan. Under the CARES Act, well, it wasn't actually under the CARES Act. It actually was from guidance that came immediately after the CARES Act. from the SBA that required businesses to use 75% of the loan on payroll and 25% on non-payroll costs. It's interest mortgage or interest on a mortgage, utilities, rent, things like that. Well, that was brought down to 60-40, just in recognition of the fact that that 75-25 formula didn't work for everybody. There are a lot of businesses that had higher fixed costs and didn't have to use so much on payroll. And so hopefully that'll help businesses and give a little bit more flexibility there. It also extended the covered period from June 30th, 2020 to December 31st of 2020, which means that borrowers, if they reduce the number of employees, or even if they reduce the wages or in salary beyond 25% for their employees, that they'll have until the end of the year to bring those numbers back to where they were on February 15th of 2020. If they do that by December 31st, then their forgiveness will not be reduced. So that is going to be helpful. That June 30th deadline was aggressive for some folks. Folks realized that they wouldn't potentially be able to bring back all of their employees or reinstate pay by June 30th. So extending it to December 31st, I think, is going to be helpful. It also allows PPP recipients to defer their portion of the payroll tax. For half of it would be deferred until the end of this year, the other half until the end of 2021. So under the CARES Act, businesses were originally prohibited from taking advantage of that program if they got a PPP loan. Now with the Flexibility Act, they could take advantage of both options, which is helpful. It also extends the loan term from 2 years to 5 years. The interest rate is still going to be at 1%. You're still going to have the payments deferred for 6 months, but that means your monthly payment will be lower because you're going to have a 5-year now amortization period, which I think should help a lot of folks. But it is going to be important to note that if you did get a PPP loan before June 5th, before this bill was enacted, you're still going to be subject to the original terms of your loan, which is 2 years, 1%. And so for folks that received a loan after June 5th, they can take advantage of the 5-year term. Unfortunately, it does not include 501c6s, chambers of commerce, trade associations, other nonprofits. Obviously, at the U.S. Chamber, that's a big priority of ours to help so many of the chambers around the country that have been doing a great job responding to this pandemic. We did our best to get that included in this bill. We were not successful in this round, but we're hopeful that we're going to be able to get C6s and other nonprofits included in the next phase 4 package. Additional guidance that we saw from a couple of weeks ago was that essentially we found out that regardless of how much a borrower uses on payroll, they should expect to have something forgiven. So even if they use well below 60% of the loan amount on payroll, they will still have a portion forgiven, and the forgiven amount will be determined by it will be 60% of what you spend on payroll will determine your forgiven amount. So essentially what you'll do is, from a mathematical standpoint, is you'll take and this is for borrowers that spent less than 60% of the loan on payroll. They would take the amount that they ended up spending on payroll and divide that by 0.60, and that would get them their forgiveness amount. So we did see that issue cleared up a little bit from the SBA. Identities of the borrowers will not be released by the SBA. That was done to encourage more folks to take advantage of the program that were worried about their information being made public. And then also the prohibition on criminal convictions. So folks with criminal convictions, that was moved down from 5 years to 3 years, once again with the intent of making it easier for businesses to apply and encourage more folks to participate in the program. So that being said, the next couple of slides are really going to focus on the forgiveness process. I'm going to make sure to get these slides to Sally and Bob as well, so you can disseminate that to the group, everybody on the call. And we also have a lot of this information at our website at uschamber.com. So there's going to be a lot of information in here. If you have questions, of course, feel free to ask them at the end of this program, but then also this information will be available for you to look at and take a little bit more time to dissect. So we're really going to think about how we determine the maximum amount of loan forgiveness over this 24-week period. And there are 4 steps that we've identified. The first one would be to identify what your qualifying expenses are. The second would be to identify your 24-week period. And then you'll want to determine the amount, if any, forgiveness that will be reduced. And then lastly, apply the 60% rule, making sure that you spend at least 60% of the loan on payroll. If not, then applying that 60% rule to determine, that whole divide by 0.60 will determine ultimately your forgiveness amount. So the qualifying expenses, of course, as just about everybody on this phone call knows, payroll, mortgage interest payments, rent and lease payments, utility payments for gas, electricity, water, transportation, telephone, internet, those all qualify as expenses that you could use if you have a PPP loan. Of course, payroll expenses, that includes salary, wages, commissions, tips, parental leave, family leave, sick leave, also the employer contribution for healthcare coverage, retirement, state and local taxes for the compensation of employees. And then also it's important to note that for independent contractors or sole proprietors, the payroll costs will include wages, commissions, income, or net earnings from self-employment or similar compensation. So that's important to note as well. And then also for independent contractors, they're able to take advantage of the non-payroll expenses such as interest, rent and lease payments, utility payments, so long as they claimed a deduction for those expenses on their 2019 Form 1040 Schedule C. If they did that, then they could also claim those expenses for forgiveness with the PPP loan. So those are the qualifying expenses. I think just about everybody, like I said, on this call is aware of what those are. The second thing you want to do is identify your 24-week period. The 24 weeks will begin either on the day the loan was dispersed, or for borrowers with a more frequent pay schedule, it could begin on the first pay period following the loan disbursement. So those are your two options for when to start that 24-week period. Then you'll want to, the third thing you want to do is determine the amount, if any, that forgiveness will be reduced. And the way, the two things that will potentially ding you as a borrower are if you reduce pay, so reduce your salary or wages of your employees on a per employee basis by more than 25%. If you do that, that'll ding you. And then also if you reduce the number of full-time equivalents that you have, that you can also get dinged for that as well and see your forgiveness reduced. If you reduce more than 25%, the way that they're looking at that is if you have it on a per employee basis, if you've reduced wages or salary by more than 25% on average over the course of that 24-week period, relative to the quarter beforehand. So that's going to be kind of the reference period, the base point that they're looking at. So that'll be, for most borrowers, that'll be the first quarter of the year, so January 1st to March 31st. If you see more than a 25% reduction in pay relative to the pay that the employee was receiving in that period of time, then you will have your forgiveness reduced. And the example that I like to give to explain how this is going to work is if an employee is earning $1,000 a week and they have their wages reduced to $700 a week, then you're going to be looking obviously at a 30% reduction. That first 25% is fine. So you're allowed to reduce wages and salary by 25%. So the first $250 of that $300 reduction is still forgiven, but the extra $50, that extra 5% will not be forgiven. And that's going to be multiplied, because this is going to be a 24-week period, that'll be multiplied by 24, that amount. So whatever that extra reduction is will be multiplied by 24. And so in that case, you'd have $1,200 for this borrower. In this example, they would have $1,200 reduced from their forgiveness. And it's also going to be important to note that even for borrowers that, let's say the money ran out after 12 weeks or 13 weeks, and they end up applying for forgiveness, before the 24-week period runs through, if they made those kind of reductions, the same reduction that I pointed to in this example of 30% or $50 in this case, then when it's calculated how much of the forgiveness is going to be reduced, it's still going to be that amount, $50 times 24, even if it only took place for a 12 or 13-week period. When they're doing the calculation, it'll still be multiplied by 24. So that's something to absolutely keep in mind if you're thinking about potentially reducing the pay of your employees. I think it'd be advisable to first apply for forgiveness. So once that money is out, whether it's 10 weeks, 11 weeks, 12 weeks, however long the money lasts for your business, immediately afterwards to apply for forgiveness, and then make the reductions in pay afterwards. Because if you do it beforehand, then the penalty is going to be issued as though that happened over a 24-week period instead of just a 10, 11, 12-week period, whatever it was. So it might be a little confusing, but that's what we've seen from the SBA on that issue. So that's the wage issue. For the reduction in full-time equivalents, of course, if you reduce the number of full-time equivalents relative to either several of the reference points that have been identified by the SBA, then you could also have your forgiveness reduced. So the reference points that they're going to be looking at are either the amount of employees or full-time equivalents you had from February 15th to June 30th of 2019, January 1st to February 29th of 2020, or in the case of a seasonal employer, they're going to be looking at a consecutive 12-week period between May 1st and September 15th of 2019. So you want to keep the same FTE count at the end of your loan period, 24-week period, or if you end up applying for forgiveness before you get to 24 weeks, you're still going to want to keep the same number of FTEs as you had on any of those reference periods. There are, of course, exceptions, though, to some of these rules, and I mentioned them a couple of slides ago, in particular with this December 31st deadline. So long as you reinstate wages by December 31st to what they were on February 15th, or if you reinstate the FTE count by December 31st relative to what they were on February 15th, then you're not going to have your forgiveness reduced. So those are two important safe harbors for businesses to be aware of. But then also what we saw from the SBA was additional guidance about a month ago that said that borrowers will not be penalized for FTE reductions if they made, so long as they made a good faith written offer to rehire an employee during that period, but it was rejected by the employee. So if they made that written offer and they could provide evidence that the offer was made and the offer was rejected, if they provide evidence to the lender that that took place, then they will not be dinged for having a reduction in their FTE count. Also, if an employee was fired for cause or voluntarily resigned or requested a reduction in hours, the same thing applies. The employer or the borrower will not see their forgiveness reduced as a result. So those are a couple of important exceptions to the FTE count, and then of course those two safe harbors that I mentioned for FTE reductions and wage and salary reductions. I think that those are going to be important for folks to pay attention to. And then lastly, you're going to want to apply the 60% rule. As I mentioned, you're going to be mandated to spend at least 60% of the PPP loan on payroll in order to maximize your forgiveness. For borrowers that spend less than 60% on payroll, what they're going to want to do is take the amount that they spent on payroll and divide by 0.60, and that will get them their maximum loan forgiveness amount. So an example that I like to give for that one is if you are a borrower and you received $20,000 in a PPP loan and you ended up spending $6,000 on payroll, well, if you take 6,000 divided by 0.60, that'll get you 10,000 because 6,000 is 60% of 10,000. 10,000 would be the maximum loan forgiveness amount. So that's kind of a clear-cut example that I like to give for that. And then ultimately, after you've done those calculations, you'll find that the borrower's loan forgiveness will equal the smallest of three things. So it's either going to be the full PPP loan amount. So that's if you spent it the right way, at least 60% on payroll and you didn't have any reductions in wages, or you didn't have any reductions in your FTE count, then you should get the entire loan forgiven. If you did have reductions, then you'll take the calculation from step one. So step one, that's all of the qualifying expenses. And then you'll minus any of the reductions that you saw in step three. So those are the wage reductions or the FTE reductions. And then the third option would be for folks that spent less than 60% on payroll, as I mentioned, and they would just take the amount that they did spend on payroll and divide by 0.60. So those are the three outcomes that you're going to see as a borrower. And you would kind of take the less of those three. But I think for most of the folks, hopefully, they're going to be able to take advantage of full forgiveness so long as they did the right things and used the money for the purposes that it was intended, and spent at least 60% on payroll. As long as you did those things, you should be okay. Now, the recording requirements, a lot of questions on that as well. There's a lot of verbiage, particularly on this slide, so I'm not going to go over all of this. But payroll documentation, you're absolutely going to need to have documentation of your full-time equivalents and full-time employees, and then also your non-payroll expenses. So you're going to have your documentation of what you're spending on utilities, rent, lease payments, things like that. Make sure to have that with you. And then the forms, the application forms themselves, of course, you're going to have to fill out. And thankfully, the SBA, after a lot of complaining and quite frankly, a lot of comments from the U.S. Chamber as well on this, made significant changes to their application form last week. It's no longer that big, confusing, onerous 11-page document that we initially saw. So thankfully, we got rid of that. It's now been pared down to 5 pages or 3 pages. There's an easy application that's 3 pages, and that'll be for independent contractors, sole proprietors, and businesses that aren't expecting any reduction in their forgiveness. So that's for businesses that spent more than 60% on payroll, that didn't have any reductions in wages or salary or FTE count. Those folks can work off of the 3-page easy application, and then other borrowers can work off of the 5-page application. Both of them are dramatic improvements over the 11-page version that we saw about a month ago. So that should be helpful. And you can find that at the SBA's website, or if you go to treasury.gov/cares, you could find those applications and then more information as well. So you'll need to submit that along with this documentation here to your lender, so that you'll be able to do that once you've, of course, spent the PPP money, and then your lender will have 60 days to render a decision on forgiveness, to notify the borrower, and then also to notify the SBA as to what the lender's decision will be. So for more information, kind of as I referenced, a lot of this stuff we have on our website. If you go to uschamber.com/PPP forgiveness, you can get this directly. We have a whole kind of slide deck presentation. We have a guide that you can work off of. It's really helpful, kind of breaks it down in plain English. And then if you go to uschamber.com/save-small-business, we have additional guides and resources for the PPP program, for the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, Main Street Program, all kinds of good stuff there. And speaking of Main Street lending, just really quickly, I just figured I'd throw this out there because this program became operational, I think, last week. This is the Federal Reserve's program. It's not being done through the SBA, but this is something that you can, similar to the PPP program, you'd apply through your lender. And this is really for kind of mid-sized businesses. So that's for folks with less than 15,000 employees or $5 billion in 2018 revenue. They'd be able to apply for a Main Street lending loan. And the minimum loan size is $250,000. The maximum would be essentially, for most cases, $35 million. It's a 5-year term. You'd have the interest rate, I think, is a little more than 3%. Minimal risk retention for the lender. And so there were some changes like the risk retention for the lender, for example, that were made kind of over the last couple of weeks to make this hopefully more attractive, not only for lenders, but also for borrowers. They extended the terms, the deferment of payments. So that could be an option for some of the folks on this call. Just wanted to throw that out there. Even if you're a small business and you got a PPP loan and you need additional assistance, you could apply for a Main Street lending program loan as well. There are restrictions, obviously, on how you use the money through executive compensation, stock buybacks, dividends, things like that. But this program is now operational and will be in effect until September 30th of 2020. If you want more information on this, you can go to the Federal Reserve's website directly, or you can go to our website, uschamber.com, the sites that I just referenced. I have the direct link to our Main Street Lending Program Guide at the bottom of this page, but would welcome you all to check that out if there's interest in this program as well. And then lastly, to kind of wrap things up and talk about where we are in DC now in the aftermath of the CARES Act and the PPP Flexibility Act. Obviously, there are a lot of other issues that are out there that need to be dealt with from an economic perspective, certainly for small businesses, but then also for state and local governments, for individuals that are on unemployment. There are a lot of things that are still out there that Congress needs to consider to address the ongoing pandemic and the slowdown in business activity. And so what we've seen is the House kind of laid down their marker over a month ago. It was about a month and a half ago, right, when they passed the HEROES Act. That was kind of their marker for what they wanted to see in the next large coronavirus package. This would be kind of a CARES Act 2.0 or Phase 4 bill, as they call it. That was a $3 trillion bill that was passed by the House on a partisan basis. It was pretty much entirely Democrats in support, Republicans in opposition. This was a $3 trillion package, about $1 trillion for state and local governments. That's kind of the red line issue for Democrats in the House and in the Senate. They really want to see state and local governments be able to get access to money because coffers have been hit so hard by the loss in tax revenue. So that's a big component. There's a second round of checks to individuals, right? So that $1,200, $2,400 round of checks is the second round of that. It extends the pandemic unemployment insurance through January of 2021. As many of you are aware, that additional $600 per week expires on July 31st. So that's going to be kind of an action forcing event, by the way, for Congress. But the HEROES Act would extend that extra $600 through January of 2021. A good thing that it does is it did include C6s and chambers of commerce for PPP. So hopefully that we can build off of that momentum and get that included in the final package. But that's kind of what the House has made clear. That's what their priorities are going to be. For the Senate, very different. They're on a very different page. They're very much looking at kind of just doing more oversight. There's not as much of an appetite for having a huge spending package. They really kind of want to focus more on other things, oversight of the CARES Act, liability protections, and particularly as we see the economy start to move in the right direction. We saw unemployment tick down in May. We've seen from across a number of states the beginning of a V-shaped recovery, hopefully. I think that there's even more reluctance, quite frankly, on the part of Senate Republicans to act quickly, even though Mitch McConnell has said that he's willing to put together a Phase 4 bill. I think Republicans in the Senate are going to be, and in the House, are going to be much more reluctant to sign on to a big package like the one that we saw come out from House Democrats a month and a half ago. So very different pages right now. I think the red line issue for Senate Republicans is going to be liability protections. They've been insisting on that so that businesses are protected from exposure claims so long as they're doing the right thing and complying with the guidance that's available. Same thing for manufacturers of PPE, healthcare workers, making sure that they have liability protections is going to be very, very important. I think what we're going to look for in this next bill will be PPP changes. I think that the fact that there's still $140 billion in the program, Congress is going to have to figure out what to do with that. And if they're going to open up another round of PPP loans, that's possible. Are they going to finally allow chambers, C6s, and other nonprofits to take advantage? I think that those are all options that are on the table. There's going to be thoughts of other assistance for small businesses, particularly hospitality, leisure, restaurants. Those are businesses that are going to take many, many months to recover. And so they've already been hit hard and they're going to continue to be hit hard. And so what kind of assistance should the government be thinking about for those businesses? State and local funding, of course, that's absolutely going to need to be addressed. Liability protections, in our view at the U.S. Chamber, needs to be addressed. There is going to be some sort of extension of unemployment insurance. Like I said, July 31st is the cutoff. That's when that $600 per week goes away. So that's going to be an action forcing event for Congress. They need to address that issue before then. Child care assistance, as people go back to the workplace, and child care providers need to operate with social distancing rules, and you kind of have fewer options available for where your children are going to be. There needs to be thinking about what Congress can do to provide assistance for child care providers. So those are some of the issues I think that'll be included in this broader Phase 4 package. There's also talk of tax incentives for PPE or tax exemptions for PPE for businesses that make those investments. There's all kinds of ideas that are out there, and I think that all of these things are going to be included in some form or another in the discussion for Phase 4. The timing on this is probably going to be the end of July because that July 31st deadline is out there for unemployment insurance. Congress likes to wait until the very last second to move on these things, and I imagine that that'll happen once again. But just wanted to keep that kind of on everybody's radar, that there is more stuff coming. And I don't know, potentially another opportunity to do another webinar on whatever comes from phase 4. But that's kind of the discussion in DC right now. And happy to take questions on that. And then of course, happy to do my best to answer any questions that there might be on the forgiveness portion and how to go through that process for PPP.
Jennings, thank you so much for a very comprehensive presentation that kind of gives us a very good overview of what's happening, not just what has happened, but also kind of what's happening right now at a federal level. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question for Jennings, please feel free to post it in the chat. You are welcome to post it to me privately. I am not mentioning anyone's names in terms of the questions that are being asked, so please feel free if you have something that you want to ask that you just want to ask. So Jennings, we'll start with the first question, and this question actually kind of has two parts. There's a part that I think Sally and I will need to take back to the city of Mesa and just ask, but in regards to a lot of cities offering funding packages for their small business communities, in Mesa we call it the Mesa Cares Grant. Is there any restrictions on a business to receive PPP funding if they have received one of these local care packages?
I can look in. I don't think so. I've heard of that, because this has kind of been on a state by state or local government by local government basis. Because from the CARES Act, there's a significant portion of money that was set aside for states in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and some states obviously use that money for various purposes with healthcare, testing, and all of that. But then also some states set aside money for small business assistance programs. And I've seen cases where some states put those strings or those requirements, or I guess prohibitions attached to it, that said that if a small business received a PPP loan, they're not eligible to apply for a loan through our program or a grant through our program. I don't know if that's necessary. I don't think that's across the board. I think that's kind of state by state. But there's nothing in the CARES Act that I've seen that would prohibit a business, if they got a PPP loan, from getting a loan or a grant through one of these other local or state programs. But I can double check.
Okay, so for the second part of that, I think Sally and I will check in with specifically with the city of Mesa and make that available to everybody based on what we find out.
Okay.
Next question, just to reiterate, you did say at the beginning of the presentation that you would go ahead and make the slides available to us, which we'll send to everybody. Mm-hmm. If a business was funded prior to June 5th, it sounds like their period would be 24 weeks. They'll be using the majority of their PPP funds for payroll by the end of this month, so June. Would they be able to apply for forgiveness based on the fact that they've gone ahead and used those funds right away?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they don't have to wait the full 24 weeks.
Okay, so there's no you have to sit and wait till after this date to do it. You can, okay.
The funds are exhausted, they can apply for forgiveness. Yeah.
Very good. Next question. After the last PPP legislation, any PPP loan recipient, regardless of when they received their PPP loan, could request a change in terms to increase the loan to 5 years. Is that not true?
Let me look into that, because I'd heard that they were, so for folks that received a loan before June 5th, that they had to stick to the 2 years. I can double check on that. That's what I had heard, but I can double check to see if changing it to a 5-year term is an option. But certainly for folks after June 5th, it'd be 5 years, but I can double check for folks before.
Okay. And just to let everybody know, for items that Jennings or Sally or I will need to follow up on, we'll compile one sort of follow-up document that has the answers to all these items and send it to all of the attendees all at once, so that you're not getting kind of piecemeal emails from people. So there was a sentiment that the change that was made recently regarding the release of borrower names using tiered amounts received under the PPP loan. So let me kind of rephrase that a little bit. Somebody is saying that they thought that there was a change made recently regarding the release of borrower names using tiered amounts received under the PPP loan. You want to address that, or do you know?
I'm not quite sure what the question is. I mean, I know that from what we saw a couple of weeks ago and what Secretary Mnuchin kind of has stated, that the SBA will not be releasing the borrower identities or information, and that's kind of different from what the SBA has typically done. But I think that change was made to try to spur more businesses to get off of the sidelines and to apply for a loan if that was their major concern. So as far as I've seen and what I've read and heard, identities will not be disclosed.
Okay. Next question: how is the program defining a FTE or full-time employee?
So I believe that's 30 hours per week would be a full-time equivalent.
Okay. Okay, I'm seeing some of the same questions pop up a couple of times here. Hang on. So next question: if you received a grant, so will that amount be deducted from the forgiveness amount?
Yes, if you receive the EIDL grant, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan grant, then yes, that is reduced from your forgiveness amount.
Okay. And then, okay, it looks like that question that we've already addressed. So for the 1 trillion that you mentioned for state and local governments, oh, hang on, just got moved around there. Do we know if any will be directed towards IT funding specifically?
I don't know about that, just because, I mean, I'd have to look through the House bill to see kind of exactly what the language was. But that House bill is kind of dead on arrival in the Senate. So the House and Senate still have to work to finalize some language for state and local assistance. So I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like.
Okay. So our next question is in regards to forgiveness. And the questioner says, haven't been able to find out how long after the 8-week covered period that a borrower can still apply for forgiveness. For instance, if the 8 weeks ended on Friday or ends on Friday, when must they have submitted their application for forgiveness?
If they can submit it, I mean, I think they have until, I think the end of the year, until the end of the covered period to submit. So if they want to do it, tomorrow or the next week or next month, I mean, that's fine. There's not going to be a penalty or anything like that associated with it. So they have until the end of the covered period to apply.
Okay. And next question is, what happens if employees' hours are reduced because of just no work? So not because the employer has reduced them, but they're just naturally reduced because there's no work.
Right. I've seen this question pop up a lot. I just encourage people to keep paying their employees, even if there's nothing for them to do, even if you're paying them to stay home, keep paying them, because that's the only way that the money is essentially going to be made free and you're going to get it forgiven. So, because that question does come up because a lot of folks, businesses don't have anything necessarily for these employees to do. And so it seems kind of weird to be paying them. But if you want to maximize your forgiveness, you need to maintain their pay at least 75% of what it was, even if you have no work for them.
Thank you, sir. Next question. Per new guidance provided, borrowers with loans received before June, I think this is actually a statement more than it is a question. Loans received prior to June 5th can extend their loan term to 5 years if their lender agrees. Is that? I
think that's, yeah, so that was the question that came up earlier.
Yeah.
I'd have to confirm on that. Like I said, I'd heard that wasn't an option, but maybe that is. Maybe, if the lender agrees to that, maybe that could be an option, but I'll double check and get back to you.
Okay, so next question is from an employer. So the employer has offered their employee more hours, in essence, by doing some other work, say working around the house or so on and so forth. And they declined, saying that they had work to do at their own, or other work of their own to do. Does that mess up the employer?
Well, I mean, if that's going to count against the FTE count, the full-time equivalent calculation, then what the employer is going to want to do to protect him or herself from seeing a reduction in loan forgiveness is, make it clear that an offer was made. So a written offer to come back to work or to do the work that's being requested, and that offer was rejected. And if the employer or the borrower can show that to the lender, then they will not be negatively impacted. They're not going to see a reduction in forgiveness.
Okay. And next question, is the full amount of the EIDL deducted from forgiveness or just the amount of the initial deposit? So the 1,000 or the 10,000?
So it's just the grant, because the EIDL you have to pay back. I mean, that's a loan. So that's going to be dealt with separately, but the grant portion that will need to be, so up to $10,000 grant portion, that will need to be deducted from the PPP forgiveness amount.
Okay, so just a reminder to everybody, if you do have a question, please feel free to post it in the chat. Jennings, I do have a kind of a question here, kind of from the house, if you will. What are the priorities for the U.S. Chamber right now in this new round of legislation? So what's the U.S. Chamber focused on?
Sure. Well, C6s, as I mentioned, absolutely at the top of the list. Making sure that we get chambers of commerce included for PPP assistance and other nonprofits too. So C4, civic organizations, things like that. I mean, they really need help right now, but especially chambers. I mean, you guys are doing such tremendous work responding to this crisis and helping out your business members, but at the same time, chambers have really been kind of left out and are not able to access a whole lot of anything. So that's really a shame. So that's one of our major priorities that we're pushing for. Other big one would be liability protections. So we are pushing hard to make sure that businesses receive the legal safe harbors that they need to be able to operate and not have to worry about frivolous litigation or COVID-related litigation, so long as they're doing the right thing and complying with CDC guidance and OSHA guidance, state and local health guidance. As long as they're doing the right thing, they shouldn't be potentially subject to exposure-related claims, or even for manufacturers, right? So you have like breweries and distilleries that are stepping up to the plate making hand sanitizers. I mean, they shouldn't be subject to frivolous lawsuits as well. So that's been a really big focus of ours. And I think that the childcare component is one that's gaining a lot of attention too. And we've talked about that quite a bit internally. Childcare providers saw, I think, a 35% reduction in employment over the course of this pandemic. They were hit really hard. They're going to be asked to operate in the red, essentially, with a limited amount of children that they can see, while we're asking parents to go back to work. And not every school is going to be open. That's not going to be an option for everyone. So childcare providers need some sort of assistance. So that's also kind of climbing on our kind of ranking list of what our priorities are going to be. Those are some of the big ones for sure.
And I promise that was not a loaded question. That was not a, but I do have another question for you. How can the participants in this call today support that phase 4? How can they be engaged in kind of making sure that phase 4 goes basically the way that they would need it to?
Sure. Well, you can always engage with members of Congress directly. I think that's always really helpful. For example, I saw Congressman Biggs sent a letter to, I think it was to Secretary Mnuchin, asking for C6s to be included, right, in the PPP program. I mean, that kind of thing is huge. And he doesn't do that without hearing from not only chambers, but from businesses and from people in his community. And so when you have a member of Congress like Congressman Biggs, who has a fair amount of significant influence, that writes a letter to Secretary Mnuchin, that goes a long way. And the same thing can be said for other members of the delegation. Certainly Senator Sinema and McSally are great. You're really in an advantageous position to have somebody like Sinema, especially, who is kind of that really bipartisan member that likes to work with Republicans and Democrats. She's really reasonable, looking for kind of what, her constituents and businesses in Arizona are saying. So having, being able to access her and have her ear on issues and reach out to her office, really helpful. Same thing for Congressman Stanton, another kind of, moderate centrist Democrat. So when we're talking about issues like liability protection, for example, which is kind of, you see it's a partisan issue. It's more of Republicans talk about it. Democrats, a lot of Democrats agree, but don't talk about it as much. That's a prime opportunity to reach out to Senator Sinema, Congressman Stanton, and say, hey, liability protections needs to be addressed in phase 4. And those are the kind of centrist members that can help make it happen. So you all are in a really good position to have some influence on the process here.
Thank you. We do have just a few minutes left. If you do have a question you want to sneak in here at the end, please post it in the chat. I'm happy to relay it to Jennings. I do have, I had one more question, but it just slipped right out of my head. So I'm at this point going to go ahead and pass it back over to Sally and kind of let her wrap it up.
Thanks, Bob. Jennings, do you have any? Oh, we do have. Will workers' compensation insurance possibly be a covered expense?
So the state portion of workers' comp, that's a qualifying expense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
payroll.
you. Do you have any last parting words for us? How are you doing? How's the U.S. Chamber doing?
We're doing well. Yeah, we're hanging in there. Everybody's still working remotely, and we've been told to do that and plan on doing it until Labor Day. So that's the reality we're in. And I like to travel. I'm usually the Western region guy, so I'm used to being out there and seeing people in person. So that's been tough to do this via webinar and Zoom for the last couple months. Hopefully, we can meet in person again soon. But we continue to work really hard on these issues. This is quite an unprecedented time and unprecedented challenges we're dealing with. And we really kind of rely on the partnership and relationship that we have with local chambers and local businesses to be the voice on these issues. And a lot of these changes that we made to PPP, for example, I mean, that came from what we were hearing from businesses. We relayed that to Congress. We relayed that to the administration, to the SBA. That's why we saw some of the changes, quite frankly, that we saw with the SBA on the application, things like that. So we continue to have a role here, but really it's because of the outreach that businesses provide, and then also chambers. You guys are doing such a great job. So continue to keep it up. We really do make a difference, and I think that you guys are doing a great job of responding to this crisis.
Well, we appreciate your support, but we appreciate your support as much on behalf of our members and the businesses in our community. And we couldn't obviously do this without you guys. So unless there are other questions, or unless Jennings, you have anything else, we'll go ahead and end today's call, and probably just be on standby until we hear that there's some changes or some updates that you can come back and share with everybody.
Yep, that sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Hey, everyone, thank you very much for participating today, for your questions, and for being here to support our chamber. We hope you're doing well, and you can always reach out to any of us at the Mesa Chamber, and we'll do what we can to promote doing in your business and make sure that people know that you're open and you've got things going on. So stay in touch, stay well, and we'll see you again on the next Zoom. Thank you.